People ask me sometimes why I stopped moving. They frame it different ways. Some ask when I settled at Thresh. Some ask why I took the work I took after. The slower work, the kind that keeps you in one place. A few of them, the ones who knew me before, ask it flat out. Dara, what happened to you out in the corridor that last time? Because you came back different. I tell them it was the child. They nod like they understand. They don't, but I don't blame them. You couldn't understand it without having been in that relay post at the 440 marker in the dark with the smell of sealed metal and stale atmosphere, opening a container you expected to hold water reclaim filters and finding instead a pair of eyes looking back at you from the floor. Silver eyes. Veil. Enormous in the way all veil eyes are enormous, catching what little light there was and holding it so the irises looked like two pools of still mercury. She was sitting in the corner of the container with her knees pulled to her chest and a piece of torn fabric in her hands. Not a doll, just a strip of something, pale and hemmed, that she held the way you hold on to the last thing you have. She was silver-skinned in the way all veil are silver-skinned, smooth as river stone, but along her temples and the line of her jaw there ran a tracery of bioluminescent patterning. Fine lines like frost on glass that pulsed very faintly in the dark. In a living, healthy veil child, those lines glow steady. Hers were pulsing slow, too slow. That was the first thing I noticed, before I even processed that I was looking at a child at all, that the light in her was running low. The second thing I noticed was that she did not move. Most living things move when a hatch opens, and a human comes in smelling of corridor dust and old sweat. She just looked at me. She had been there a while, and she had used the time to make a decision about what she would do when someone came, and what she had decided was, wait and see, don't run yet. See what is first. I respected that. 7 years in the corridor teaches you the same thing. I should tell you about the corridor so you understand what I mean by 7 years of it. The Ashen Corridor is roughly 900 kilometers of lowland between what used to be the Compact's two southernmost relay cities, Ardith in the east and Vithis in the west. Both collapsed in what the Compact calls the infrastructure failure, which is the Compact's way of saying, we expanded too far, too fast, and when the outer supply chains broke, 2 million people found out simultaneously that their city ran on external oxygen recycling they didn't own. What's left is rubble field and salvage country, and hard terrain for about 200 kilometers in every direction from each ruin, with a band of contested wasteland between them that nobody has formally claimed, because claiming it means defending it, and defending it costs more than the salvage is worth. Unless you're the Kareth Syndicate. The Syndicate doesn't defend the corridor so much as it taxes it. They move in sections, 3 to 8 salvage crews at a time, working a grid, collecting from anyone they catch, carrying anything worth carrying. They're not soldiers. They're accountants with weapons. They have a ledger in their heads at all times. What does this person have? What will it cost to take it? What is the margin? They do not take things when the margin is wrong. They are not cruel for cruelty's sake. They are, in their own way, entirely rational, which makes them one of the most dangerous things in the corridor, because you can reason with a cruel man sometimes, can find the crack in him, but you cannot reason with arithmetic. I had been navigating around the Syndicate for 4 of my 7 years in the corridor. I knew their patrol cycles, their crew rotations, their preference for high ground. I knew which relay posts they'd stripped and which they'd marked for future harvest, and which they'd written off as not worth the fuel. The 440 marker was on their written off list. I'd checked it twice a year for 3 years, and it was always empty, which is how I knew something had happened to the Veil column. Because the Veil don't leave children in relay posts. They don't leave anything behind they can carry, and they will carry a great deal. They had been moving north. I'd seen their track 2 weeks prior, a large group, maybe 40, moving in good order, and then I had seen nothing, no further track, no scatter pattern that would indicate dispersal, nothing. I'd told myself they'd found a secondary route. I'd told myself it a lot. I crouched down in the hatchway of the container and looked at the child, and she looked at me. "How long?" I said. She didn't answer. That was fine. I wasn't sure she spoke anything I spoke. Veil language is tonal in a way that human vocal cords can approximate but not replicate cleanly, and I only had maybe 200 words of it. Trade useful vocabulary, the kind of thing that gets you a water price negotiated. I looked around the container instead. 3 weeks of surviving, approximately, based on the evidence. A small pile of water reclaim packs in the corner, almost depleted, the kind carried in emergency kits, which meant she'd found the post's emergency locker and worked it open. Some wrappers that had held dense calorie ration bars. Again, emergency stock, and she'd rationed them, because the count was about right for 3 weeks if you ate small. The piece of torn fabric, a smooth stone palm-sized, that she must have brought in herself or found inside, which she had placed very precisely in the center of the container floor. I didn't know what the stone meant. I thought later it might have been something her people do, marking a waiting place or marking a grief. I didn't ask. What I did was sit down fully in the hatchway, cross my legs, put my pack down beside me and start going through it, not making a show of it, just doing what I'd have done anyway if I'd stopped to rest. Checking my water, my rations, my maps, doing it slow and with my hands visible. After about 10 minutes of this, she shifted. Not much, just settled her weight differently, let her knees drop slightly from her chest. It was the first thing she'd done voluntarily since I walked in. I counted it. I pulled out a ration bar, high protein, dense, salt neutral. I'd learned early that veil metabolisms are sensitive to high sodium, which is why corridor salvage isn't ideal for them, even when they can find it. This particular bar was as close to neutral as I stalked. I broke it in half. I set one half down on the container floor, equidistant between us. I didn't push it toward her. I didn't look at her. I went back to my map. She took it 7 minutes later. I know because I was counting. We slept in the container that night, me in the hatch, her in the corner, the stone back in its precise position in the center of the floor. In the morning, I sat outside in the gray lowland light and thought about what I was going to do. The rational calculation was not complicated. The syndicate had hit the veil column, probably 3 weeks ago, probably at the Ford crossing near the 390 marker where the ground goes soft and a large group moves slow. The child had survived somehow, hidden maybe, or small enough to be overlooked in the chaos or fast enough to run. She'd found the relay post and she'd done everything right. She'd rationed. She'd waited. The syndicate would know there were survivors. They always counted. And they would know that a surviving Veil child meant a surviving heir to the debt structure. The Veil cultural obligation debt was a real financial instrument the Kara Syndicate had been trying to monetize for 2 years. A living Veil with full lineage documentation was worth more to them than everything I'd ever carried in 7 years of corridor salvage combined. They would come back to check the column's scatter zone. They would check the relay posts. They would check the 440 marker eventually. I thought about all of this. I thought about the clean calculation of it. I thought about the 450 kilometers of corridor between me and the nearest Veil settlement in the north, and the state of the child's bioluminescent tracery, and the fact that she was failing slowly on human emergency rations that weren't designed for her metabolism, and the 3 syndicate crews I knew to be operating in the northern sector. Then I went back inside and packed up the empty wrappers so she wouldn't have to look at them. And I sat down where I'd sat the night before, and I opened my map and I started planning the route. I have tried to explain this to people since the decision, and I find I cannot explain it in terms that satisfy them. They want there to have been a moment, something she did, something she said, some gesture of trust or need that moved me. There wasn't one, or rather, the decision was made before any of that. I opened the container, I saw her, and something in me that had not operated in 7 years simply operated. It didn't ask my opinion. It was already happening while I was still thinking about the clean calculation. I don't know what to call that. I called it a problem to solve for a long time because that was a frame I was comfortable in. I was solving a problem. I was navigating terrain. I was moving through the corridor, which is what I did. I told myself that for about 2 days, and then I stopped telling myself things and just moved. Her name, or the closest approximation I could make of it, was something like sail. The first syllable rising, the second falling, the whole thing said on a breath rather than pushed. She told me this on the second day of walking, not as an introduction, but as a correction. I had called her something generic, a sound I used for attention, and she stopped walking and looked at me with those still silver eyes and said, very clearly, sail, and then started walking again. I said it back. I got the tone wrong. She made a sound that I came to understand was not quite a correction, more like acknowledgement that the approximation would do. A sound like, close enough, this will work, we can operate on this. I have met diplomats who couldn't communicate that efficiently. I have met compact officers who took 3 days to establish working terms. Sail did it in 8 words and a tone correction in under 4 seconds, without stopping walking. She was quick, which I had not expected. I had expected to carry her. I had factored carrying weight into my load distribution before we left the relay post. She did not need to be carried. She moved in the Veil way, which is light and economical, each step considered but not hesitant. Weight shifted forward from the heel rather than distributed flat, which means Veil can move on uncertain ground faster than a comparably sized human. She kept up with my pace without effort for the first 2 hours. Then she slowed, and I slowed, and we settled into a rhythm that was slightly below my natural pace and slightly above hers. I noticed she never looked at her feet. She watched the horizon and the midground in the way you learn to watch in the corridor when you want to see things before they see you. I had developed that habit over 3 years. She had it already. She'd learned it somewhere, or she'd been born to it, or the 3 weeks alone in the post had accelerated something that was already there. She also listened better than most adults I'd moved with, not just for sound, for the absence of it. There is a particular quality of quiet in the corridor that precedes threat. Birds stop, wind drops, and the kind of insects that live in the salvage fields go still. I have a reflex for it now that operates below thought, a tightening across the shoulders that happens before my conscious mind has registered what changed. On the 3rd day of walking, I felt it, a sudden closing down of ambient sound to the east, and I stopped and turned, and Sael had stopped half a second before me. She was already looking east, not at anything visible, just listening to the nothing, the way you do when the nothing is saying something. We stood like that for maybe 40 seconds. Then the sound came back. A bird, wind, the distant grind of settling ruin. And we both moved on. I didn't comment, neither did she. But after that, I stopped second-guessing her instincts when they differed from mine. I didn't ask how she'd learned any of it. We didn't have the language for that question, not yet. What we did have was the map. I had learned early, by the end of the first day, that Sael understood maps, not in the way a trained navigator understands them, but in the fundamental way. She looked at a map and she understood that the marks represented real things, that the distances were proportional, that lines meant edges and obstacles. I showed her our route on the second evening, tracing it with one finger, and she watched, and then she put her own finger on a point about 30 kilometers west of my proposed line and looked at me. I looked at where she was pointing. It was not on any marked route. It was a section of the corridor I'd crossed twice, both times skirting to the east, because the Western Passage was low and flood-prone in the wet season. "You know that place?" I said. She moved her finger slightly. Not the exact point, but near it, and then she made a gesture I'd seen Vale make when they're indicating direction of travel. A flat hand, palm down, moved in the direction the group came from. She was telling me the column had passed through there, that she knew that ground. I looked at it more carefully. If the flood season was early, and it had been, I'd seen the water levels, the Western Passage would be closed. But if it was early enough before the deep accumulation, there was a transitional window of about 3 weeks when the ground would be muddy but passable, and the Eastern Routes Syndicate patrols would still be positioned, assuming everyone used the high road. I hadn't considered it because I'd assumed the timing was wrong. I looked at Sail. She waited. "Show me," I said. I pointed at her. I pointed at the map. I held up 2 fingers, 2 days in that direction. She looked at the map for a long moment. Then she nodded. One short motion, very certain. We went west. She was right. The passage was muddy, knee-deep in standing water for about 4 kilometers. Cold and slow and hard going. Sail managed it without complaint, which I would have found remarkable in a human child, and found remarkable in her. We came out on the far side on hard ground as the light failed, both of us wet to the thigh, and I built a fire in the shelter of a fallen relay antenna, and we dried out, and I made the closest thing I had to a hot meal from my stores. While we ate, I looked at her tracery. In the firelight, it was easier to see the state of it. The pulse was still slow. Not slower than it had been at the relay post, but not improving either. The Veil bioluminescent tracery is a physiological signal system. It tracks metabolic state, emotional state, and a few things that human medicine doesn't have clean categories for. Dim and slow means the body is conserving. It means the body is not well fed enough on the right things to run it normal. I was keeping her alive on human rations, but I was not restoring her. I went through everything in my pack that night after she was asleep. I was looking for anything closer to the Veil dietary baseline. They are highly adapted to bioluminescent flora, which they process differently than humans, converting certain wavelength compounds that are essentially inert to us into usable nutrition for them. I didn't have any. What I had was dense calorie human ration stock and a single pack of trade goods that included some dried fungi I'd acquired in the South 2 months ago, species unknown to me that I'd been planning to sell. I opened the fungi pack and held it near the sleeping child and watched. After a moment, the tracery along her left temple flickered. Just once. But it was the first unprompted flicker I'd seen. All the other pulses had been the slow, even minimal ones. I put the fungi in the side pocket of my pack where I could get to them fast. In the morning, I mixed a small amount into her share of the ration. Not enough to know if it was the right species. I was not going to risk a toxic reaction, just enough to see if she'd eat it without distress. She ate it without distress. By mid-morning, the pulse of her tracery was slightly steadier. Not normal, but steadier. I made a note of the species markings on the pack. I needed more. I needed a lot more. The nearest place I knew of that might stock Veil-compatible foodstuffs was a trade post at the 510 marker, which was 140 kilometers north, and had the disadvantage of being in a section of corridor the Syndicate considered semi-active. I had been planning to skirt it by 60 kilometers. I changed the plan. You do that in the corridor. You keep revising the plan. If you fall in love with a plan, you die, because the corridor doesn't honor plans. It honors attention. The Syndicate found the relay post at the 440 marker on day 4 of our walk. I know this because on day 4, I had an elevated position. We were on the spine of a long ridge that ran north-northeast, which I used for the sight lines. And I saw the dust signature of 2 vehicles moving in from the south, converging on the 440 marker from different approach vectors. Syndicate search pattern. They were being thorough. From that distance and altitude, I could not see any detail, but I didn't need detail. I counted 2 vehicles, the type that run 4 to 6 crew each, which meant 8 to 12 Syndicate personnel, now at the 440 marker, finding an empty container and 3 weeks of signs that someone had been living in it. And then finding my tracks, because I'd left tracks in the first kilometer from the post before I hit hard ground. My tracks going west. I looked at Sail. She was sitting on the ridge beside me, looking in the same direction, and something in the set of her face. That stillness, that waiting and seeing quality she had, told me she understood what the dust meant. She'd seen things approach before. She knew the shape of pursuit. I picked up my pack. "We move," I said. She was already standing. The next 8 days were the hard work of the crossing, and I want to be honest about what that was. It was not dramatic. It was not a chase sequence in any sense a person sitting safely somewhere could enjoy as a story. It was physical endurance management and route calculation, carried out simultaneously, with the constant low-level attention you need in the corridor. To not step in the wrong place, breathe the wrong air, or miss the approach of something that intends to collect your assets. I was navigating three things at once: the terrain, the syndicate, and Sale. The terrain was the most predictable of the three. I had crossed this section of the corridor 6 times and I knew its habits. The way the ground softened after rain in a predictable band from the 470 marker northward, the relay infrastructure that ran half a meter below the surface near the 490 marker and made that whole section unreliable for wheeled vehicles, the 2 places where the flood channels ran above ground and could be crossed clean versus the 1 place where they looked crossable and weren't. I knew which ruins were structurally compromised and which were solid enough to shelter in and which had the particular chemical off-gassing that old industrial ruins sometimes have, the kind that doesn't kill you but gives you a headache that lasts 2 days and slows your movement. I moved us through all of it by memory, adjusting by observation, the way you do when the route is a thing you know in your body, rather than a thing you look up. The syndicate were more complicated. The pattern thinker had positioned assets, and while I could not see them at all times, I could infer their movement from the small signs. The corridor gives up when something large is moving through it. A dust signature where dust didn't belong. A bird flush in a direction that matched no natural cause. The absence of the small scavenging animals that live in the low ruins and have very good instincts for human presence. I revised the route twice in 4 days, each time adding distance against adding risk, doing the calculation in my head and arriving at the same answer. Slower is safer, and safe is the only thing that matters. Sale was the easiest of the 3, which was the thing I had not expected. She did not complain. She did not panic. She matched my pace adjustments without being told, which meant she was reading the terrain well enough to know when I was speeding up because of good ground and when I was speeding up because of threat signature. She slept when I said we would sleep and moved when I said we would move. She ate what I gave her and saved the stone she'd taken from the relay post in the breast pocket of her robe. I saw her check for it each morning. When she woke, the same automatic gesture I make, checking my knife, is still on my hip. It became clear that she was not afraid of me. She had decided something about me in the relay post, and she had not revised it. And she was operating on that decision with the same calm commitment she'd used to ration her emergency supplies. Not trusting blindly, but choosing to trust on the evidence available and not wasting energy on second-guessing it. I found that difficult to receive the first few days. Not unwelcome, difficult. I was not accustomed to being trusted. 7 years in the corridor makes you useful for yourself and careful of everyone else and what Sale was offering. Not warmth, not need, but the specific gravity of a child who has made a decision and is betting on it, required something from me that I had not exercised in a long time and that operated differently than I remembered. What I noticed as the days accumulated was that she watched me the way she watched terrain, with the same quality of focused, undramatic attention, not studying me for threat. She had already made that assessment and closed it, watching me the way you watch something you're trying to learn. If I stopped for a reason she hadn't identified, she would stop and look until she found the reason herself, and then she would file it. I could see her doing it, the slight pause, the scan of the ground or the air or the light, and then the small settling that meant, found it, categorized, moving on. She was building a map of how I moved through the world the same way I was building a map of how she moved through it. We were both, without discussing it, learning each other's operating language. On day 6, we reached the 5 for 10 marker trade post. It was a risk going in. The syndicate knew this post, used it themselves for resupply on this stretch. But the risk of not restoring Sale's metabolic baseline was higher. The tracery had steadied on the mixed rations, but it had not improved further. I needed proper Vale foodstuffs. I had things to trade. I left Sale in a collapsed infrastructure shelter about a kilometer south of the post. I showed her the map, showed her where the post was, showed her the direction of our route north. I showed her what to do if someone other than me appeared before I came back. She looked at the map for a moment, and then she reached into the breast pocket of her robe and took out the stone and held it out to me. I looked at it. Palm-sized, smooth, dark gray with a faint vein of white quartz running through it. "No," I said, "that's yours." She held it out again, more firmly. I understood then, not warmly, not sweetly, but with the clarity of the corridor, that this was a transaction, not a gift. She was giving me something of real value to her as a deposit against my return. She was being practical about it. She was not asking me to promise anything. She was creating an incentive structure. I took the stone. I put it in my breast pocket. I went to the trade post. The post keeper was a woman named Thela, who had operated the 510 marker for 11 years and had survived by knowing exactly how much to cooperate with everyone and exactly how much to not. She knew who I was. I had passed through 6 times, and she did not ask questions she'd made a policy of not asking. I told her I needed Vale dietary supplementals and bioluminescent flora extract and whatever fresh equivalent she had that was Vale metabolic compatible. She looked at me for a moment with the expression post keepers get when they're recalculating risk. Then she went in the back and came out with a box that was more than I'd hoped for and told me the price. I paid it. I paid over it. I paid enough that Thela would not discuss the sale with the next party that came through, which is also a thing you can buy at the 510 marker if you price it correctly. I was back with Sael in under 2 hours. When I came into view of the shelter, she stepped out of it. Not a running, just stepping out. Deliberate, the way she did everything. I reached into my pocket and gave her back the stone. She examined it briefly, as if confirming it was the same one, and put it back in her robe. Then she looked at the box under my arm, and the tracery along her temples pulsed, once, hard, the strongest single pulse I'd seen from her since the relay post. I don't know if it was a physiological response to smelling the right food or something else. I opened the box and showed her what was in it, and she reached in and took a small amount and ate it standing there with a kind of seriousness that was not relief exactly, more like the satisfaction of a correct assessment. She had made a calculation about me, and the calculation had returned the right answer. We ate properly that night for the first time. I watched the tracery while she slept, and it was running steadier than it had been at any point since the relay post. The pulse was stronger. Not normal, not yet, but heading the right direction. She was coming back. On day 9, we ran out of easy terrain. The Kareth Syndicate runs its operations with a ledger, as I said. But they also run them with personnel who have been doing this long enough to stop thinking purely in terms of margins and start thinking in terms of patterns. The person who had taken up the search for Sale. I did not learn his name until later. I knew him first by his methods. Was one of the pattern thinkers. He had looked at my track from the 440 marker and looked at the Western Passage I'd used and looked at the 510 marker sale record that Thela had not reported but could not fully erase because the post has syndicate monitoring hardware. She cannot disable without triggering an alert. And he had drawn a route. He had drawn the same route I was drawing. I found this out because on day 9, I came to the top of a long slope overlooking what should have been an open run of about 40 kilometers to the edge of syndicate-controlled territory, and found instead a vehicle positioned on the high ground to the north and another on the eastern approach, closing the corridor. Not charging toward me, positioned, waiting. He'd run the calculation on where I'd have to come out and put assets there 3 days ago, and waited. It was, I will say this honestly, good work. If I'd been 2 days faster, I'd have been through before he positioned. If I'd taken the main route, I'd have hit the moving search teams and had more options for lateral movement. I'd taken the smart route, and it had put me in front of someone smarter than a moving search team. I pulled back off the slope before we were visible and sat with sail in the dead ground and looked at the map. The eastern approach was closed. The northern run was closed. To the west was a long detour, 80 kilometers, adding 3 days through an area with no water sources I trusted. To the south was the search I was already ahead of, which would close that route within 18 hours. I sat with this for a while. Sail sat beside me and looked at the map where I was looking. After a few minutes, she reached over and put her finger on a point. Not a route, a specific marker on the map. A small symbol I used for underground infrastructure, specifically a maintenance conduit from the pre-collapse Ardith water system that ran north under this section of terrain. I'd marked it 2 years ago when I'd sheltered in it for a night. It was too small for vehicles. It was barely large enough for a person who didn't mind moving at a crouch for 4 kilometers. "That's tight," I said. She looked at me. I looked at the conduit symbol. 4 kilometers of underground dark, ceiling maybe 1.5 meters, possibly flooded in sections given the wet season. And then it came out on the far side of the ridgeline, inside what I believed to be the watch arc of the northern vehicle, but with enough ground between us and it that we'd be into the broken terrain before they could close. I believed. That was the problem. I hadn't been in that conduit in 2 years, and I hadn't come out its northern end, only its southern. I didn't know what the far exit looked like, or how much it would put us in or out of sightline. I looked at Sael. She was already looking at the conduit marker. I thought about the stone in her pocket. I thought about the weight of her keeping up with my pace without complaint. I thought about the way she'd stood outside that shelter when I came back from the trade post. Not waiting anxiously, just standing there, having made her assessment and committed to it. "All right," I said, "we go under." The conduit was 4.5 kilometers, not 4, which I'd mismapped 2 years ago, and it was not flooded, but it was wet. Water running about ankle deep in the central section, cold enough to be unpleasant, the ceiling low enough that I moved at a constant crouch for the last 2 kilometers of it. Sail moved through it in the Vale way, efficient, careful, utterly without complaint. In the dark sections, and there were 3 of them, stretches where no ambient light penetrated, and we moved entirely by touch and memory. She put one hand on the back of my jacket and kept it there. Not pulling, not slowing me, just holding. A point of contact so she knew where I was. So she had something to track. The dark sections were not short. The second one ran for nearly 1 kilometer by my count. I kept talking, low, the entire way through it. Not words she could understand, just sound. The same way you talk to an animal you're moving through a difficult place, giving them something steady to orient on. I told her about the conduit, that it was pre-collapse water infrastructure, that the city that built it was gone. But the pipe had lasted, because pipe lasts when nothing else does. That in another 200 meters the ceiling would rise again and we'd be able to stand. I don't know how much of it she followed. She followed the tone of it, I think, the steadiness. I kept my voice the same all the way through, not reassuring in the false high way, just even. The same as how I sounded when there was nothing to worry about, because there was nothing to do about the dark except move through it. When we came into the 3rd section of ambient light, a crack in the conduit ceiling 40 meters long where daylight fell in a pale stripe, she let go of my jacket, not gradually, just let go. I didn't look back. I kept moving. She came out of the northern exit half a step behind me and said nothing about it. I didn't either. There was nothing to say. The northern exit put us on broken ground about 600 meters east of the northern vehicle's last position. Too close. I moved us immediately into a gully that ran east-west, and we went east fast for 40 minutes, putting distance and terrain between us and the vehicle's line of sight, and then I turned north again. He would find the conduit entry. He was smart enough for that. But the conduit had added time to his calculation, and I was now inside the broken terrain I'd been trying to reach. And in broken terrain, I had 7 years of specific, granular, step-by-step knowledge against someone operating off a general map. That was the advantage I had been moving towards since we left the relay post. In broken terrain, I am not navigating. I am remembering. Every fissure, every shelf, every place where the ground goes soft, or the air shifts, or the old infrastructure surfaces and creates a false floor. I know this terrain the way you know the inside of a house you grew up in. In the dark, by feel certain of each step. The syndicate's vehicles couldn't follow us. Their crew could, on foot if they were willing. But on foot in this ground, I could dictate where they went and how fast. The next 30 kilometers took 2 days. I moved in the corridor's rhythms, 6 hours of movement, 2 of rest, using the cold hour before dawn when nothing moves comfortably and I know the ground. Sail matched every rhythm without being told. The tracery was running solid now, not the bright, fast pulse of a healthy Vale child at full metabolic function, but steady, and the lines that had been faint at the relay post were sharper. She was coming back to herself. There were small things in those 2 days that I did not know what to do with. She started teaching me Vale words. Not intentionally, not as a lesson. She would name something as we passed it, once, quietly, and move on. And if I repeated it badly, she would correct the tone without breaking stride and move on again. She named the ground type when it changed, named the light when it changed, named the bird that moved out of the ruins ahead of us in a specific way that in Vale apparently has its own word, which translates approximately as the startling of something small by something larger than itself, heard but not seen. She had a word for that, one word. The efficiency of that still sits with me. I did not know at the time whether she was doing this so we could communicate better, or whether she was doing it because naming things out loud was something she needed, a way of holding the world steady by speaking it. I thought later it was probably both. Language is like that. It serves the speaker as much as it serves the listener. She also started pointing things out, not threats, not route choices, but things. A particular rock formation that caught the morning light in a way that made it look briefly like something else. A section of old infrastructure where the metal had oxidized into a specific shade of copper green that she seemed to find interesting. I did not know the Vale aesthetic vocabulary well enough to understand what she was expressing when she pointed at these things. I thought it might be beauty. I thought it might be something that didn't have a clean human category. I filed it without a label and kept moving. On the morning of the second day of the broken terrain crossing, she spoke to me in Vale. It was a long sentence, or what passed for one. Vale language compresses a great deal, so what sounds like 5 words can carry a complex relational statement. I caught maybe a third of it. Something about moving, something about the direction we'd come from, something about, I thought, a question about what was behind us, whether the people following were still following. Yes, I said, but not close. 2 days, maybe more. She absorbed this, nodded once. We're going to make it, I said, and then felt strange saying it, because I don't say things like that. Not as a rule. The corridor teaches you not to predict forward, only to read present. But I had said it, and I found I had meant it, not as optimism but as assessment. I had put enough terrain and knowledge between us and the syndicate's assets that the calculation had shifted. We were ahead of it. She looked at me. Then she said something short, 2 syllables, one tone that I didn't have a vocabulary entry for. I asked her to say it again. She said it again with a slight tonal variation, and something about the variation made me think it was a name, not my name. A title maybe, or a category. I asked, what does that mean? But I didn't have the Vale to ask it right. So I just pointed at myself and said the word back at her with a questioning inflection. She seemed to consider this for a moment. Then she touched her own chest, lightly, over the stone in her pocket, and she said a different word, her name, Sail, and then touched my arm and said the first word again. I thought about this for a while. The closest translation I was ever able to get, years later from a vile interpreter in the North Settlement who had the patience to explain it. It's not a word for protector. It's not a word for guardian. It's a word that describes specifically the person who moves through dangerous ground ahead of you, not to scout, not to protect in the sense of shielding, but to walk the path first so it is known, to make the unknown ground known. The Veil use it for the eldest in a group who leads the crossing of difficult terrain. It implies something about the relationship between knowledge and care, that knowing the ground well enough to cross it is itself an act of love. I didn't know any of that at the time, but something in the way she said it, matter of fact, no ceremony to it, a category she had decided on and was now simply applying, got into me, not warmly, not softly, the way a true thing gets into you. It just becomes part of what you know. The Syndicate's pattern thinker caught up with us on day 12, not with vehicles. We were still in the broken terrain, and he'd known enough to leave the vehicles and come on foot with 3 crew. He found us at a rest point in the early evening, while I was heating water and Sail was asleep against my pack, which she'd started doing somewhere in the last 4 days. Using my pack as a pillow, not my arm, not asking for it, just doing it. In the practical way she did everything. He came in alone. The 3 crew stayed at the perimeter of my sightline, positioned, not advancing, which told me this was a conversation before it was anything else. He was tall, middle-aged, dust-covered the way you get when you've been moving hard for days, and he had the Syndicate's look about him. Not aggressive, just calculating. He sat down at the edge of the firelight without being invited, which was either confidence or a specific kind of threat. And he looked at me. "You're Daravos," he said. "Corridor surveyor, independent, 7 years out of Thresh. I know your work. What do you want?" I said. He looked at Sail, sleeping against my pack. Something crossed his face that I couldn't read. Not contempt, not desire, not threat. Something like professional consideration. He looked back at me. "The Veil debt instrument attached to that child is worth a great deal," he said. "Not to you. Not in the way you could use it. The Syndicate's position is that the instrument defaults to us on maturity, which occurs when the last Veil heir comes of age. That's 18 of their years from now. If you give us the child, you walk out of the corridor with a percentage, enough to stop walking the corridor, if you wanted." I looked at him. "She's been eating your stores," he said. "Using your water. You've taken significant risk to move her this far. The Syndicate recognizes these as costs incurred. We're prepared to compensate you for them." He was not, I noted, threatening me. He was, in his own way, being respectful. This was a business conversation. He had evaluated me correctly as someone who understood business conversations, and was offering me a rational exit that avoided violence, which costs the Syndicate resources, and got them what they needed. It was again good work. "How far north is the settlement?" I said. He blinked, just once. "The nearest Veil settlement," I said. "In the north. How far?" 2 days, he said. "Perhaps less for you." "Then we're done here," I said. The silence that followed was not long. 3 seconds, maybe 4. He was recalculating. I could see it happening. The ledger flip behind his eyes, from business conversation to operational problem. He had 3 crew at the perimeter. I had a fire, a pack, a sleeping child, and 7 years of knowing this ground in a way nobody else in his crew did. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I told you earlier this was not a story of violence as spectacle, and I meant it. What happened in the next 2 minutes was not theatrical. It was not impressive to watch, I think, if you were watching from outside. It was quiet, and it was fast, and it was the result of 7 years of learning that the corridor does not forgive hesitation, and that if a calculation has come out wrong for someone, the only thing they can do is accept the answer quickly. He had 3 crew. He had a business model that required the child to be alive and presentable. I had no such constraint on his crew. By the time it was over, Sail was awake, sitting with her back against my pack and her knees up and her eyes on me. She had not run. She had not hidden. She had sat up and watched in that way she had, with the waiting and seeing quality she'd had since the relay post. Taking the information in, deciding what it meant, holding the assessment steady. The pattern thinker was not dead. I want to be clear about that. He was not capable of following us, and he would take some time to get himself to a position where he could signal anyone, but he was not dead. I had not needed him to be dead. I needed him to be behind us. I took stock of what his crew had been carrying. I added water and some supplemental rations to my pack. I looked at Sail. 2 days, I said. I pointed north. She looked at me with those still mercury eyes, and she said the word again. The one that meant, the person who makes the unknown ground known. Then she stood up and picked up the smooth stone from where it had fallen in the commotion and put it back in her pocket and waited for me to lead. The last 2 days of the crossing were the easiest of the 12. The broken terrain gave out onto flat, firm ground under a sky that cleared on the second morning to something close to actual blue. Not the gray-brown the corridor usually runs, but something paler and wider. I hadn't seen sky that color in a long time. I watched Sail's face when she saw it, and her expression shifted. The first strong expression I'd seen from her that wasn't focused on immediate practical matters. Something open in it. Something that was not quite recognition, but was adjacent to it. Like seeing something you'd been told about and were now confirming was real. The tracery was running bright by then. Not just steady, bright. The lines along her temples and jaw were lit with the even, quick pulse of a healthy veil in good metabolic function. She looked different than she had at the relay post. The same face, the same eyes, but with the light in her running the way it was supposed to run. And I understood better now why veil biology works the way it does. It is not cosmetic. The light is how they show each other they are all right. In the late afternoon of the second day, I smelled water. Not the mineral flat recycled water of relay post tanks, but running water, natural, which meant we were close to the northern watershed that fed the Vale Settlement's valley. I stopped and I looked north, and I could see the beginning of the ridge line that marked the valley's edge, and beyond it, faint, at this distance, but real, smoke from fires, more than one fire, a settlement. Sail stopped beside me. She looked where I was looking, and I watched something happen in her that I had not seen happen before. A change so sudden and complete it was almost startling. She had been, for 12 days, the child who waited and assessed and committed and moved without waste. She had been the most compact traveling companion I'd ever had, efficient, certain, undemanding. And now she looked north at the smoke from the fires, and all of that efficiency cracked open slightly. And what was underneath was just a child. A child who had been alone for 3 weeks before I found her, and then alone in the specific way that being with only one person when you need many people is still a kind of alone, and who was now looking at smoke that meant her people. She didn't run toward it. She looked at me first. Checked. One more time with those silver eyes, the way she had been checking since the relay post. Not for permission, but for information. Reading me, I nodded. Go ahead, I said. She went. Not running. The Vale don't run toward things. They move with that same efficient, forward-weighted stride, only faster. I watched her cross the distance between us and the base of the ridge, and then start up the ridge, and then crest it. And then she stopped at the top. She turned back. She was 40 meters away, and the evening was going gray at the edges. She looked at me for a moment. Then she took the stone out of her pocket and held it out toward me, at this distance, which was not offering it. It was showing me she had it, that it was still there, that the transaction she'd made at the shelter was complete and accounted for on both ends. I raised one hand, flat, palm out, the way you indicate. Acknowledged, I have it, we're square. She held the stone for another moment. Then she put it back in her pocket and turned and went down the other side of the ridge. I sat down on the ground and listened. After a few minutes, I heard voices, distant, the direction of the settlement. And then I heard a sound I had not heard in 12 days, which was Sail's voice, raised to something above the quiet, functional sounds she'd used during the crossing. She was talking, fast in Vale, in the full tonal range of the language that she'd been damping down for 12 days of traveling with someone who couldn't hear it right. She was talking, and I couldn't hear words, but I could hear that she was talking, and that other voices were answering. I sat on the ground at the bottom of the ridge in the last of the evening light and listened to that for a while. 7 years in the corridor. The sound you hear most is wind. Wind through ruin, through rebar, through the old infrastructure gaps, through the passages under relay antenna, and across the flat flood season ground. It's not an unfriendly sound. I'd made my peace with it. It's the sound of a large indifferent space doing what large indifferent spaces do. More than one voice at once is different. I had forgotten that. How different? I did not go into the settlement. The Vale know I was there. Someone came to the ridge, an adult, and I could see them from my position and could see me, and they looked at me for a long moment and then went back down. I think they sent someone. I waited long enough to know that nobody was coming out with hostile intent, and then I picked up my pack and turned south. I had been thinking about Thresh for 2 days by then, about the work that could be done from a fixed point, about the specific things that 7 years of corridor knowledge could be worth to people who needed to cross it safely, if someone were in one place and could be asked, rather than moving and unreachable, about the kind of work that does not require you to know every exit before you go in, because you're not the one going in. I did not think about Sail on that walk south. I thought about the route and the water and the weight of my pack and the changed season in the sky. I did not think about her because there was nothing left to think. She was accounted for. The situation was resolved. The calculation had completed. I thought about the word she'd used. The one I hadn't been able to translate yet wouldn't be able to translate for 2 more years. The one that meant the person who makes the unknown ground known. I thought about the specific quality of that definition, that it was not about standing between something and danger, not about strength, not about being willing to fight. It was about knowledge as care, about moving through the world with enough attention that your passage through it makes things easier for someone coming behind you. I had been doing that in the corridor for 7 years without knowing that's what it was called. I walked south. I came back to Thresh in the early spring. I had been gone 14 months. Thresh had changed the way things change when you're not watching. A few new structures, a few collapsed ones, the same people in different configurations. They had not expected me back. A few of them, the ones who'd known me before, said I looked different. I told them I was the same. I think I was wrong. I took a room in the eastern quarter. I started doing what I'd been thinking about on the walk south: mapping work, consultation, route guidance for people who needed to cross the corridor and didn't know how. I was expensive because I was good and because I was there. I did not go back into the corridor for 8 months. When I went back, it was for a week, a specific short job, and I came home when it was done. There were letters, eventually. Not from Sail. She was young, and the Vale don't write the way we write, but from the settlement, from the adult who had come to the ridge and looked at me and gone back. The Vale have a tradition. They account for debts carefully, and they are scrupulous about gratitude, which they do not express as warmth, but as specific acknowledgement of what was given and what it cost. The letter listed everything. It listed the route I had taken, and the time it had taken, and the resources I had spent, and the risk I had carried, and it stated very precisely that the settlement considered the debt to be significant and offered its specific reciprocal obligations. It did not use the word that Sail had used, but it listed at the end, in the formal Vale way, the name by which I was known in the settlement, which was the word Sail had given me. The person who makes the unknown ground known. I wrote back. I told them the debt was settled. I told them that the resources spent were mine to spend, and the risk taken was mine to take, and that I required no reciprocal obligation. Then I thought for a while, and I added, I would like to know she is well. They wrote back in 3 months, which is fast for the northern routes. They said she was well. They said she was learning the settlement's pathways and had recently been given a small responsibility, guiding the youngest children through the more complicated interior corridors of the settlement's lower levels, which were a maze to newcomers, but were knowable if someone took you through them the first few times. I read that several times. Then I put the letter in the box where I keep things I want to keep, and I went back to work. That is the whole of it. I crossed the corridor for 7 years, and she was the reason I stopped. Not because she needed me to be stationary. Not because anything required it. Not because the corridor had worn me out. I stopped because somewhere in 12 days of walking with a child who made a decision about me and held to it without waste, something had shifted in my accounting of what a fixed point was worth, of what it meant to be somewhere that could be returned to, of what it meant to make ground known enough that someone smaller than you could navigate it. I had been thinking of home as a thing that didn't apply to me. Sales showed me, without a word about it, and without intending to, that knowing somewhere well enough to bring someone else through it safely is the same thing as belonging to it. I am in Thresh. I am still here. If you need to cross the corridor, I can tell you how. That's what I do now.